Want a breakdown of some of the latest topics from college to the pros? We interview many individuals to share their knowledge about the news stories surrounding the teams and its players. This is Nothing But That Sports Talk. And welcome to Nothing But That Sports Talk. I'm Rafique Louison, alongside my very special guest who's also been interviewing the players with me, Erica Ayala. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Rafique. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I mean, with everything we've been doing this season, it's only right. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your platform, what you're covering the Liberty for, and what you do, education, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. Well, thanks you for giving me an open slate there. Things certainly have changed for a lot of us as we return to sports during the coronavirus pandemic. But my name is Erica Ayala. I was a college athlete myself, played softball at Elon University, and never really thought much about doing sports media and sports journalism, but the opportunity came about to cover women's hockey, and from there, a lot of other opportunities as well. So these days, I am running a platform that I'm slowly growing into a podcast and video podcast network. It's called Sports Talk with ELA, Erica Ayala. And so not only do I cover women's hockey, which is where I got my start, but I cover women's soccer and, of course, women's basketball in the New York Liberty. So part of that Sports Talk ELA, I try to regularly get shows up that focus just on the New York Liberty and some of the people that cover the Liberty, some of the players that have played for the Liberty in the past. And it's been something that has been really exciting for me as someone who went to her first WNBA game in Madison Square Garden.
You mentioned you went to your first Liberty game at Madison Square Garden. What is that experience like for you?
Well, I mean, it was great. I grew up here in New York, and you grew up knowing that Madison Square Garden is a place where, the best of the best go, whether it's to perform or to play. Women's basketball, seeing women's basketball at Madison Square Garden for all those years was really cool. And then it was kind of surreal to go back then as a reporter, remembering being all the way up in the rafters with my mom and my two sisters, rooting on Becky Hammon.
You mentioned Becky Hammon.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Wow. I can't believe you went through all that all the way towards being the reporter you are right now.
Yeah, it's a wild ride, but Becky Hammon was one of the players that I remember. She came up undrafted, and I used to turn to my mom and I say, "Mom, why don't they put Becky Hammon in the game more?" So I don't know, maybe I've got a little bit of a scout or coach in me too.
Well, I remember Becky Hammon playing for New York Liberty, she really knew how to run a team back then. I mean, she had some stints in the playoffs going up against teams like the Indiana Fever and Detroit Shock, which is now the Dallas Wings. And you got to give it credit where credit's due to New York Liberty. Managed to get one game and managed to hold their own in the games that they lost in overtime against the Detroit Shock. And I do remember how the Liberty, they've always been competitive, but haven't been able to keep games close because they had a lot of tough losses against elite teams like the Minnesota Lynx and the Phoenix Mercury, led by Diana Taurasi. And to this day, Diana Taurasi is still on the roster. And we also had Kansas Parker playing for the Los Angeles Sparks. So it's crazy to think that some of the stuff that we've seen in the 2000s still lasts to this day in the first year of the 2020s.
Well, I mean, it's tough. I think what you're getting at is that the New York team has always been competitive, and really up until the last 3 seasons, they haven't had very many losing seasons. Back when we had conferences, the New York Liberty could be counted on to be one of the top, if not the top team in the East. And unfortunately, that has not led to a championship. So in 24 seasons, 25 next year, the New York Liberty have been there through the entire WNBA. They've seen players come and go that have won elsewhere, but they've never been able to, the New York Liberty, that is, win a championship.
Yeah, you mentioned this right there. The New York Liberty have been winners of their 4 championship appearances, losing to teams like the Houston Comets and the Los Angeles Sparks, which was led by Lisa Leslie. But at least they were able to pull off one of the craziest moments you will ever see from a New York Liberty player ever. Teresa Witherspoon, literally full court, forcing the game 3. in what was obviously the first WNBA Finals win ever for the Liberty at that time. What were your
Yeah.
impressions on that when you look back at highlights like that?
Oh, it's great. And with Teresa Weatherspoon going into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame last year, I was able to cover her enshrinement for The Athletic, and I sat down with her, and some of that video will be coming up for Gotta Get Up, which I mentioned on my YouTube channel. But I got to sit down with Teaspoon, and the funny thing was we were talking right around an anniversary of that shot, before she was headed into the Naismith Hall of Fame. And she said that the replay on NBA TV last season was the first time she actually saw that full game and saw the shot. So that was a cool moment to remember, seeing that, but then also to speak to Teresa Weatherspoon after the fact. And, I just thought it was funny that she said she'd never watched it.
Wow. Well, when I saw it, and what do you know? Mike Breen was on the call at that game, just like he's been called the New York Knicks, and he's really been out there doing play-by-play for both teams. It's unimaginable how Teresa Westbrook could hit that. And I was just watching that recap on NBA TV. All you can think of is she really did that.
Yep, she did it. But when I spoke to her, though, she remembers just being tired. That they had a quick turnaround. It forced game 3, and we only had a 3-game final, not even semifinals. Which I think I was doing some research recently. I think in 2005 they changed the semifinals to a 5-game series. But back in the first few years of the league, even the final was only 3 games. So it was, you win that night and it was a afternoon game the next day. And the Liberty couldn't get that second win to get their first title. So Teresa jokes around that the Comets players who walked her into the Hall of Fame, they never liked talking about the shot, but they always liked talking about the final for that series, which of course was the Houston Comets winning over the New York Liberty.
Yeah, it's a shame that the Houston Comets ceased to exist. And, well, at least the Los Angeles Sparks, another team that they lost to, and if I recall, it only took was just a defensive stop by Lisa Leslie to shut down the New York Liberty in one WNBA final. Lisa Leslie was just a monster in the paint, being only the first WNBA player to pull off a dunk.
That's right. Yeah, Lisa Leslie made a lot of history in this league and definitely was a strong defender. And I think I miss, some of those battles that we saw down on the post in the early years. I know a lot of people call basketball positionless, which I fervently disagree with. I think you need at least 2 positions in basketball, one of them being point guard and probably the other being center or someone down on the post. But anyway, Lisa Leslie was one of the best to do it. And certainly, the rivalry that existed in the early years, again now with the New York Liberty and the Sparks, so much it's pretty one-sided, but those are 2 of the original WNBA teams, and pretty cool to see them still in action again 24 years later.
Yeah, and 24 years later, the Liberty only managed to win 2 games in the bubble with no fans in attendance. And watching this Liberty season has been very, very difficult, especially after Sabrina Ionescu got hurt.
Well, I think before Sabrina Ionescu got hurt, I think people forget that this team was going to struggle even with Sabrina. That's something that has been very frustrating for me. As far as I think the storylines that swirl around the New York Liberty are not necessarily ones that those of us who are on the beat tend to follow. I think that this was always going to be a difficult season for the New York Liberty. I have written even before the New York Liberty drafted Sabrina Ionescu that even if Tina Charles had stayed on this team, I was not, I wasn't sure I was understanding the path with which they were going to go, that New York Liberty, that is, without making trades. And we still haven't really seen the New York Liberty make any trades. The trade that sent Tina Charles to Washington was definitely initiated by Tina. And it seems that, I just would like to see the New York Liberty. It's one thing to build out a young team, and to your point, getting only 2 wins in the wobble, and that's all fine and well. But we know history proves time and time again that, doesn't matter how many points or how many shots you're taking beyond the arc or in the paint. The one thing that breeds success in the WNBA is experience. And even with the veterans that are on the Liberty roster, there's not much experience. There's not much experience at all.
The 2 wins the Liberty did get were high quality. You got a win from last year's WNBA champion Washington Mystics. And then you had a crazy come from my win against the Chicago Sky, another playoff team who, well, if you watched last year's playoffs, you know what happened. Half-court Hebe. But
absolutely.
If you see that shot, what do you think is a lot better before we get back to talking about the Liberty season? Teresa Witherspoon's half-court shot that forced Game 3 in the WNBA Finals back in the day, or Hamby's half-court shot? Which one do you think is better?
Well, that's hard to say. Both were dynamic for sure. The Hamby heave was amazing and really set into tone a rivalry that we see in the modern game. But if I had to pick one, I'm going to go with the teaspoon shot. One, because there was no question that she was inbounds and that the shot was good. I know that there was a lot of controversy swirling around the Hamby heave. Did she or did she not step out of bounds? Also, Hamby herself has kind of talked about maybe she escaped her mind for a moment and didn't realize how much time was left on the clock. So definitely the odds were in Hamby's favor. I'll give her that, but I think I'll go with the teaspoon shot.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable because the Teresa shot was done with no time left on the clock, but the half-court shot Hamby put up, it was crazy, but anticlimactic when you consider the fact that she did it with 3 seconds left on the clock, where she could have gone at least 5 or 6 steps closer and shoot a much better 3-point shot, or just be more strategic and put a little bit more strategy to it. It's crazy, but anticlimactic. But the point is, they went on to the semifinals. They got taken out by the Washington Mystics.
Yes.
But when we're talking about the Las Vegas Aces, we'll get back to Liberty in a minute. But A'ja Wilson's MVP candidate, Erica Hamby's lined up for a candidate to be the 2nd consecutive 6th Woman of the Year. Bill Laimbeer in talks about being Coach of the Year. What are your impressions about that?
I think for me, out of those 3, A'ja Wilson as MVP is probably where I'm leaning. There's so much conversation about what MVP means. To me, it does not have to be the best player on the best team. I think if you look at Tina Charles in 2016, she was in the MVP race against Nneka Ogwumike. A lot of people ultimately rated efficiency in what Nneka was doing as more value than what Tina Charles was doing when everyone knew the ball was going to go through Tina. So I might have some feelings about that, but I think that what I like about what A'ja Wilson is doing is that like a lot of other teams in the wobble, the Las Vegas Aces have had to adjust. But what has been evidently clear since A'ja Wilson was drafted by Bill Laimbeer and the Las Vegas Aces is that the team goes the way A'ja Wilson goes. And I think we're seeing that play out this season. Players coming on and off the roster, injuries, just like anyone else. A'ja Wilson herself dealing with not knowing whether she was going to start the first game of the season as she was dealing with some ailing injury. But through it all, A'ja has been consistent and remains one of the top scorers in the league. And I love that she's doing that as a post player as well, without having to necessarily add a long range shot to her game. She can certainly shoot from the perimeter and distance, but I don't know. Like I said, I'm not really into the positionless basketball. So I like that A'ja's putting up the numbers that she is from a more traditional post position, as opposed to a Breanna Stewart, who of course a lot of people are also saying is an MVP candidate, who we know is very comfortable beyond the arc. Just for me, I think that Asia's presence in the post and overall a post player that can really be menacing in the post is just the style of basketball that I like. But that being said, you can't go wrong with Stewie either, because that is a shot blocking machine if I've ever seen one.
And not to mention the fact that the Aces had a crazy rebounding, out rebounding the Indiana Fever last night, 42-28. So that says something. Her inside presence of A'ja Wilson was a big contribution to Las Vegas Aces' success during, like, what, its third season in the league.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, so you talk about franchise tag. Again, you're not going wrong with Stewie or with A'ja Wilson. For me, A'ja gets the edge, but I think it's going to be a solid race. But I would be surprised, to be honest, if it's not one of those two as the top two vote getters.
Yeah, anything can happen in the WNBA, but
Very true.
but when we watch the New York Liberty, the coach said that he was more focusing on the growth and development of the players as opposed to trying to get into the playoffs. And it literally showed during, like, up until this final week of the season that they had a lot of development between the players, but they just have not been able to add many opportunities to win.
Well, I think I don't disagree with Walt, and you were on that call, that he got a bit bothered earlier in the week by a question of the team tanking. And I don't think that, generally speaking, we even see that in women's sports, let alone in the WNBA. I don't know that the value is that great to really go through that. I would argue across all sports, but that's neither here nor there. When it comes to the New York Liberty, I do agree with Walt Hopkins that there has been growth, there has been development. However, I am a bit stymied by the insistence to really see through the plan to shoot from the perimeter without also having more emphasis to take shots in the paint. And I think the lack of, from my perception, the lack of ability to be nimble in what the roster and what other teams are giving, but also to know that if you have shooters that aren't shooting well, one thing that you're taught as an athlete, especially as an athlete that's an offensive threat, yes, shooters keep shooting, right? But you also sometimes have to see shots go in to get that confidence. And a great way to get shots to go in is to take them from shorter range, just so you see the ball go through the hoop. Not to mention that, short range shots, if you're making those shots, you're getting on the board. And I think the New York Liberty offense has suffered, yes, because they're not making wide open long range shots, but also because they're not even attempting short range shots in the paint. And that is something that I really do think that Walt Hopkins and his staff can be challenged to think about differently. I also think that we've started to see the rotation open up a little bit, but for a team struggling so mightily offensively, I wish that players like Jocelyn Willoughby, who had a great game the other night, would have been given more opportunity to build into this system. Even Kylie Shook, it took her a while, I think, to gain the trust of a team. And that's just really tough to hear when, again, a coach is saying that it's about growth and development, and I'm down for that. I think, again, I knew even with Sabrina that this was going to be growth and development the way this team was built. But if you're preaching growth and development and also not getting players into the roster who need to grow and develop for the betterment of this franchise, then again, it just leaves you scratching your head a little bit. Even Paris Key, as she came in later in the season, she was not inserted into the lineup right away, even though the New York Liberty were desperate to get a guard that could really push tempo and change the pace of the game. Alasia Clarendon has a certain motor, even Sabrina Ionescu has a certain motor, but Paris Key can really help, I think, and part of the reason that I think she was a good pickup for the Liberty is because she can help that team in transition. And I know Carolyn Peck said it the other night, best way to get your offense going is by getting those layups in transition. I heard Dominique Wilkins, talking on the Chene and Golick Jr. show, and also talking about, listen, best way to get an offense going is to take high quality, makeable shots. And unfortunately, while looking to the future and wanting to be a team that shoots from the perimeter, I feel that the New York Liberty has tipped that curve, that curb of taking too many shots while also not making enough or creating enough opportunities in the paint.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that, well, at least the 101 defense is solid, especially Amanda Zawi. She had a game where she had 21 rebounds, and she had several games where she's putting some serious work in getting the blocks that they need, especially in one of their 2 ways against the Washington Mystics. But after that, they managed to blow a 17-point lead against Asia Wilson's Las Vegas Aces. They even allowed a game winner off her. And, well, would you be surprised? Asia Wilson's like basically lined up to be one of the top players in the WNBA in the next decade.
Yeah, and talking about when games come down to the wire, the New York Liberty have struggled again in the last 3 seasons to really have someone defensively step up and be the person to get that defensive stop. I'm thinking, of course, there was that play down the wire last season where Elena Deladon was left open in another buzzer beater where the New York Liberty were close in that game. And you saw at the time, Tina Charles, who was with the Liberty, just kind of aghast that no one picked up Elena Deladon. And credit to Washington, and of course, credit to the Las Vegas Aces, but also I'd like to see the New York Liberty franchise return to what we saw in some of the early years where you had a Teresa Weatherspoon. I mean, just an amazing defensive player for the New York Liberty, and a lot of their spark came from that defense. And you have players like Nay Odom, you have players like Kylie Shook, Jocelyn Willoughby, who say that they're defense first type players. But for some reason, we're not really seeing that part of the New York Liberty young culture rise to the top. And I really think that it has to. Again, I get that Walt wants to shoot. And I know from being a point guard myself, my coach used to tell me to shoot even if I didn't want to, even if I had I didn't have confidence that the shot would go in, because you draw the defense. But you also have to work the other parts of the game. And I just think that the New York Liberty has focused so much on perimeter shooting that they have not allowed some of the natural talent that is on this roster to really flourish.
It's going to take a while for New York Liberty to get back to being in playoff form, but not as long as the New York Knicks, but they're going to take a while because they have a lot of young rookies. And I even managed to, and you were there when I asked Odin about how she plans to pass on what she learned during her first year on to the younger generation and how she plans to mentor them the best way they can. But she's also learned how to develop to being one of the WNBA players that people should look up to going forward. And she also talked about how she wants to be a defensive player of the year in the near future. When you hear that, what went through your mind?
Well, I love it. I love that that's a goal. I love that Nay has that already in her mind. I do hope, though, that she's allowed to be allowed sounds kind of, I don't know, but I hope that as much as, again, the system is so run through the offense that that the Liberty are able to, through Walt Hopkins and his staff, to really grow Odom into being that defensive type player. I think another player that has a lot of defensive potential for the New York Liberty, who's been asked to do a lot offensively first and foremost, is Kia Nurse. And I'd love to see Kia get back to some of what made her so electric when she played for the UConn Huskies. And that came from, and when she played for the Huskies, they didn't necessarily need her offensively, but they needed her defensively. So I love that Kia Nurse has that. And I guess we'll just see how the scales tip, and maybe we'll find that there are other things that the Liberty need from their players. But ultimately, I think what we're seeing and what I'm trying to allude to is having a game plan is great, but you also have to let your players do what they do best. Again, shooters go and shoot, and lockdown defenders go and play defense. That's just what they do. So you want to make sure you have mechanisms with which to celebrate what makes your players individually strong.
Yeah, and that all comes down to how they follow the coach's system. That's what it boils down to. But looking ahead into the WNBA playoffs, we already know 7 of the 8 teams already clinched, with the Dallas Wings trying to hold off the Indiana Fever and the Washington Mystics for the very last spot. Now, which of the 5 through 8 teams you think is going to be the bigger threat to the top, to the Las Vegas Aces, the Seattle Storms, the Lynx, and also the Los Angeles Sparks?
Off the top of my head, it's without question, it's Phoenix. One, because Phoenix is always in this position. Phoenix has a way of, I don't know, kind of lollygagging through a regular season and then being completely dynamic and lights out in the postseason. We have no idea what that will look like, though, as Brittany Griner is still away for personal reasons. Bria Hartley, who was having an amazing season and really was making a case, in my opinion, for sixth woman and or most improved player, is no longer with the team. Unfortunately, suffered an ACL injury. So it's a very different situation for Phoenix in a lot of ways, as it is for all of the teams, because of the limitations of being at Bradenton and at IMG Academy. But I still think you have to respect a Phoenix team that has Skylar Diggins-Smith and, of course, Diana Taurasi.
Diana Taurasi's the GOAT. Let's not forget the championship she's won in 2007, 2014. Well, you get the points. I don't really go over how many championships she won. I mean, well, she had to struggle to defeat the Detroit Shock, and I believe she took out the Chicago Sky without too much of a hassle in what was their first finals appearance at the time. Diana Taurasi is just a GOAT. And, well, you remember the game time shot she hit against the Seattle Storm in the 2018 playoffs, even though they still ended up losing.
I do. And that was, she came up against Sue Bird probably in her best form in a number of years. So it's going to be a good playoff series. I think so many of the questions that we've had about injuries, so many of the questions that we've had about roster changes because of returning to play amid the pandemic are really going to heighten the importance of staying healthy, but also having veteran leadership and veteran presence on the court to know what to do when the game is on the line. And Dallas is learning that this season. I do think they'll hold on for that 8 spot, but they are learning that. And unfortunately, they are the youngest team in the league. Some of that experience that has really been through the dog days of them fighting for playoff spots, like a Glory Johnson, like a Liz Cambage, those who would be veterans in a season like this. Well, one, Cambage isn't playing this 2020 season, but she's also not with the Wings anymore. So I'm curious to see what Dallas will do. I think, though, that come next season, if they can keep that core together, Arike Agumbawale, Marina Mabry, and Satu Sabali, also with Ty Harris, who I think has been gone underrated as far as the rookie watch, but especially early on for Dallas, I think that, it's going to make for an exciting playoffs.
Yeah, but getting to Arike Agumbawale, she's lived up to the expectations that a lot of WNBA players expect her to become. It's like, look at all the performances she's had in the 2018 tournament. Like, remember the game-winning shot she had in the Final Four in the championship round? Like, come on. You knew that was going to get passed along to the WNBA in the near future. It was just a matter of how long it was going to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
players, you're not playing alongside children. You're playing alongside grown women in the WNBA.
Yeah, and I think the great thing about Arike, and somewhat of the sad part, is that if she had maybe another year or two, I think she's without question in conversation for MVP. I think her this being only her second season, and Dallas struggling to close games, I think makes it that she's just on the outside looking in as far as a top tier MVP candidate. But if she can keep this pace, she's got at least one MVP throughout her WNBA career.
I mean, it's tough not to give her or at least consider her an MVP candidate right now. She's leading the league in scoring, and she knows how to get off good shots. And you see the game time shot that she had against the Mystics the other day. She still got clutch genes.
I hear you. And she, I think is going to be there eventually. I'm again, I think her youth compared to other players who've been consistent throughout time this season, I think that is the one thing that I think eliminates and omits Enrique from conversation about most valuable player. I also believe it was my colleague on the Locked On Women's Basketball podcast, Gabe Ibrahim, that really was calling for a most outstanding player, because most valuable player and most outstanding player are two very different awards for me. And as far as most outstanding player, Enrique's at the top of my list.
You got to give her credit where credit's due. The lady can ball. But getting back to WNBA Finals predictions, who do you think is going to get to the WNBA Finals and take the crown?
Oh man, this is tough. Seattle's playing so well. And when they're in the zone like that, it's really tough to bet against them. I think we'll see Seattle in the final. And then, I don't know. I think that Las Vegas is probably that team right there as far as record and consistency that you're expecting to get to the final. Again, Phoenix will always make things interesting. If this were a week or two ago, I'd say Chicago has a really good shot. They've looked really tired and unfortunately are even further depleted. So I'm not sure that they'll have the stamina to really pull off a strong playoff run, but you never know because Chicago is scrappy. But I think I see Seattle in the final, and I suppose depending how the brackets work out, we could see Seattle, Las Vegas, and I think that'll be a pretty good 5-game series, and I do think it'll go the distance.
Yeah, or we could see the Las Vegas Aces going up against the Minnesota Lynx, another championship team, or the Los Angeles Sparks. And it's tough to actually get the Seattle Storm the crown right now just because you have the top record or the best record in the league or whatnot. I mean, look what happened to the Milwaukee Bucks the other night.
Yeah, you never know. That's why we play the games. I think Los Angeles is a solid team. I think they're growing. I don't have them in the final right now, but definitely possible. Minnesota is a really interesting team, and I think Cheryl Reeve is my coach of the year if I were to get a vote, just because I think she's done great with managing minutes and trusting players like Crystal Dangerfield, who I think is the leader for Rookie of the Year for just about everyone, as well as Bridget Carlton, who, want to talk about a most improved, or I don't know if she qualifies these days as sixth woman. She's gotten a few starts, but I like what Cheryl Reeve has been able to do with her team, and I think she's struck a really good balance of playing for now and playing for this season, while also giving some of her younger players and some of her players that have been role players who are stepping up a little bit of bandwidth to make mistakes. You look at a Damiris Dantas, who's been great for them down the line. I think it seems from the outside looking in that Cheryl is willing to hold Dantas accountable while also feeding her the resources that she needs to be, a Showtime type of player. Because with Sylvia Fowles out through the playoffs, not making a return for the regular season, you need good post play. You need veterans and you need good post players to win in the WNBA from everything that I've seen. And Dantas has really been able to carry the torch with Sylvia Fowles out.
Yeah, I mean, the Minnesota Lynx have been known for offensive explosion. I mean, they defeated the Liberty 103-48 in the one game. That just goes to show that their team is not a force to be reckoned with. Even regardless of what seeded they're in, you can't sleep on the Minnesota Lynx.
Not at all.
You really can't. What do you think? Is this your first year covering the Liberty, or have you covered it in person before?
No, this is about season 5 of covering the New York team for me.
Yeah, so what is the difference between covering a team through Zoom and covering it at the arena?
Well, on the one hand, it's exciting to cover the league because I have, I'm able to kind of bounce onto the conferences here and there. It's not great when I want to write feature stories because, not all teams are able to give us time with the subject of a feature story. So sometimes you're asking questions in basically what is a media scrum, and have to hope that you put out your story in a way that is unique by the time it's all edited and published. So, but I think overall, I do hope that the access across the board is open, because we know that the WNBA is best when we have so many different perspectives, especially Black women, that are able to share how they see the league.
Yeah, so many different Black women that are able to share how they see the WNBA, including an Ariel Chalmers, a Christina Williams, and I never thought I'd be saying this, a Pepper Pursley. So many African American women put in some serious work in covering the WNBA and women in sports, including you, Erica Ayala. You've done an amazing job covering the Liberty throughout the season. This is my first season covering the New York Liberty. I never had a chance to do it in the arena, but I'm glad I'm able to do it. Like, just, I mean, it may not be the type of experience that I would have gotten if we were doing it in person, but the fact that we're doing it virtually, or the fact that we even get to talk to the players during the games, during shoot around, before the games, and after the game, really makes up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're glad to have you, Rafique, and I'm so glad that you invited me to join you for this episode and to talk a little bit of New York Liberty basketball.
Yeah, and we know the Liberty are going to be a more developed and established team when we get to next season, especially Sabrina Ionescu, who only had like 4 games to show how good she could be.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think a healthy Sabrina definitely changes this team. I still would like to see a few more elements change. And then, of course, there's some decisions to be made. Hanju, as well as Marine Johannes and Rebecca Allen did not report this season, and Asia Durr will have to be worked back in as well. So I think there are definitely some rookies that showed they can compete, and that growth and development has happened, but there'll also be some decisions to be made. And I think it would also be healthy to perhaps see a little bit of a shakeup in the player pool, and see if the Liberty get into the free agents market before the draft, which they'll probably get a top 4 draft pick again, as they're already eliminated from the playoffs.
Well, to conclude this conversation with the WNBA, if you was Walt Hopkins right now, which position are you looking to fill when you drafted a WNBA rookie next season?
That's tough, because I think when you draft a rookie, you're expecting that it's going to take a little bit of time for them to grow in, but you hope you get a rookie that will come in and fit your system, and be a type of franchise player. But ultimately, I think I would like to see the New York Liberty give a rookie center, a really good try. Hanju, of course, was last year, but she didn't get a lot of time, and I'm not, and we obviously didn't see her develop with the team this year. But I'd like to see a rookie be able to come in and establish how New York is going to play in the post, especially defensively, for years to come.
Exactly. Well, we come to the end of this episode of Nothing But That Sports Talk. Thank you for joining Erica Ayala. And as we continue to finish off the coverage for New York Liberty, and I'll probably be covering the Las Vegas Aces all the way through at least the semifinals. So my season covering the WNBA isn't over yet. Thank you for stopping by, Erica Ayala. And to all the big ballers out there, get your head in the game.
Thank you, Rafique.